Today we're going to look at a remarkable lost film called Blue Water. Anyone with even a passing knowledge of early film history knows that lost films are not exactly uncommon. What makes this particular lost film interesting to us, though, is that, well, first of all, it was shot in Atlantic Canada, and secondly, it was not really lost so much as deliberately suppressed by Hollywood in an attempt to kill off the growing Canadian film industry. That's just part of the story, though. As I was doing my research, I found this totally unexpected, vastly stranger story that happened related to this film, this completely bizarre series of events that were set into motion when, of all things, the director of this film hired up a homeless man on the streets of New York City to work on the movie. This set into motion a series of events that would ultimately change the course of Canadian history forever. Also, speaking of the film industry, I haven't really updated you all about the rest of the so-called Backyard History media universe. A few months ago, there was a Backyard History TV mini-series that was launched. It was made by Bell Fibe, and because they made it, it's exclusively available on the Bell Fibe app and Bell Fibe's TV One, so if you are both of the people that have these services, you can check it out there. Also, in this Backyard History media universe, I now have 4 books, including the newest one, which is focused around mysteries, called Mysterious Stories from Atlantic Canada's Past, which features this story we're going to do today. You can order all these directly from the author, that's me, at backyardhistory.ca. Now, to our story.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard. The podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes. With your host and author, Andrew McLean.
Blue Water's director was the greatest Canadian filmmaker of his time, Ernest Shipman. 10% Ernie, everyone called him, because he personally demanded 10% of every aspect of the film. This included 10% of the wages paid to everyone, from the crew right through to the stars, and even a 10% cut of the money that was brought in at the box office. Ernie Shipman wasn't just a wealthy and famous film director, though. He was the face of a robust new Canadian nationalism in film. He was an outspoken voice declaring that Canada could and should tell its own stories through movies, and the rest of the world would pay good money to watch. Ernie Shipman had exploded onto the global film stage with his 1919 mega smash hit film, Back to God's Country. Shot on a budget of only $67,000, this Yukon-based film raked in a stunning $1.5 million at the box office, which is well over $40 million in today's money. Today, that film is perhaps best remembered for the curious bit of trivia that it was the first ever movie to include a nude scene in it. The actress who shot that scene was Nell Shipman, who was Ernie Shipman, the film's director's wife. But she was far more than someone who just took her clothes off on a screen, though. Nell Shipman was a screenwriter, she was an actress, she was a wealthy businesswoman, she was a producer, and she was the owner of not one, but 2 production houses. Which is to say that when Ernie Shipman received a phone call when he was visiting his office in New York City in 1921, he was very much a man on top of the world. On the other end of the line was a young man claiming to be a reporter for the New York Times. He asked for an interview, and Ernie Shipman told him to come to his office. When this young man showed up, his clothes were scruffy and unwashed. He was exceptionally young, and most damningly, he had no credentials. This young man was not actually a reporter for the New York Times at all. He had indeed moved to New York City from Newfoundland in the hopes of getting a job working for this famous newspaper, but his job application had been rejected. So now this Newfoundlander was not only unemployed, but he was actually homeless. He was living on a bench in a park. The closest he had gotten to the New York Times was using a rolled up copy as a pillow on the bench that he slept on at Bryant Park. In fact, that very morning, he had been awoken by a cop whacking the soles of his feet with a nightstick. Seemingly nothing could dampen this young man's incredible self-belief, though, and he jauntily described being woken up that morning as
customary courtesy paid to all sleepers in Bryant Park by New York's finest. I have personal knowledge that this method of awakening is quicker and surer than the best alarm clock.
Bestowed with an almost ridiculous level of self-belief, this young man saw his homelessness merely as a temporary setback. Later writing in his autobiography,
I was delighted to have a job on the New York Times, or, at any rate, would have one coming up in another week or two.
Not only was he absolutely convinced that the New York Times would soon change their mind on hiring him, he was also convinced that
one day a memorial plaque would be attached to the bench on which I slept.
The fake reporter asked this famous director to tell him about his new upcoming film. And so the director began to tell him about Blue Water, a film which was to begin shooting the following year in St. John. The fake reporter practically exploded with joy. Speaking quickly, he explained that he was from there. He began to launch into detailed stories about the people and the places he knew, the locations that would be great to film in, and perhaps most importantly to the financially hard-nosed director Ernie Shipman, the people who would surely invest in this film. To the director, this man seemed to know St. John better than anyone. Shipman offered the young reporter a hefty sum of money to quit his job at the New York Times and go to St. John to prepare the groundwork for filming Blue Water. And, of course, since this young man was not in fact actually a reporter for the New York Times at all, but was sleeping rough in a park, he instantly agreed. Only later did this young man realize, much to his horror, that all along the director had been talking about St. John, New Brunswick. The fake reporter, on the other hand, had actually been enthusiastically talking about his hometown of St. John's, Newfoundland. This fake reporter was none other than 20-year-old Joey Smallwood. In the 1940s, 2 decades after this, Joey Smallwood would basically single-handedly drag Newfoundland into Canada, eventually going on to become the new province's longtime premier. He would use his modern understanding of how to wield technology, much of which he learned while working on this film, to become a well-known figure across Newfoundland. And it really isn't an exaggeration to say that he personally built up support for Newfoundland to, rather controversially, vote to join Canada. But all of that is far in the future, though. It was quite literally a whole different world away from being homeless in a park in New York City. But now, because of this movie, Joey Smallwood was headed back to Canada. He wasn't necessarily happy about St. John not being St. John's, though. He sighed in his autobiography, which is called I Chose Canada.
My heart was not going to be in my work in those Canadian provinces.
Joey Smallwood laid the groundwork for this film. He explained in his autobiography how Ernie Shipman funded his films.
He would go into a town in a Canadian province, gather a number of businessmen and others with capital, and propose the formation of a local company that would finance the production of the movie film. The local people would put up 60% of the $100,000 needed, and Shipman would put up the remaining 40%. But they would agree to share the profits of the picture 50-50.
Despite both of the Shipmans being experienced business people, Joey Smallwood claimed that it was he who did much of the actual groundwork in St. John to get Blue Water funded. He promised local economic benefits, including that 85% of the money raised would be spent in the city. The original plan appeared to have been to adapt Blue Water from a book written by mega best-selling St. John author Hiram Cody. Upon closer inspection, though, Ernie Shipman felt that it would be difficult to shoot, and he abruptly announced that Blue Water would instead adapt a book by St. John's author Frederick W. Wallace. Veteran Hollywood screenwriter Faith Green arrived in St. John to write the script. According to Joey Smallwood, she
did not have an idea in her head for a scenario.
He wasn't actually exaggerating. Faith Green actually distributed a press release to the local paper saying,
"I would be grateful if any person knowing of legend or incident which would be suitable would communicate with her at the Dufferin Hotel."
Joey Smallwood talked his way into co-writing this script with Faith Green. He wrote that.
Faith Green was in her late 50s or early 60s. I was 20 and a half. And I suppose we must have been the strangest team of movie writers that the industry had ever seen.
Ernie Shipman was pleased with their work, and he began to muse about shooting 4 different films. One film in each of the Maritime provinces, and another in Newfoundland. This unlikely duo of writers traveled to what Joey Smallwood called
the 4 capitals of the Atlantic provinces,
writing scripts. Joey Smallwood liked to claim credit for having personally coined the phrase the Atlantic provinces. For reasons that are not clear, though, he consistently refused to acknowledge that Fredericton was the capital of New Brunswick, and he, throughout his career, always seemed to refer to St. John, no S, as the capital of New Brunswick, something which I'm sure pleased St. Johners very much. So Faith Green and Joey Smallwood went to Halifax, went to Charlottetown, and they went to St. John's to pen scripts for these 4 future films.
The movie to be made in Prince Edward Island ought to be based on their famous fox ranching activity.
The first of this Atlantic film quartet was made, and that was Blue Water. The script itself was lost. The late author David Folster researched the history of the film extensively for his book Discovering the Movies in New Brunswick, and though he never found the script, while flipping through his research notes held at the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick, I think I found perhaps the funniest description of the script that Joey Smallwood and Faith Green wrote, with David Folster calling it a moralistic story about drinking and staying in school. This wasn't to say that David Folster actually disapproved of it, though. He compared Blue Water's script to Treasure Island, and he noted that it was, quote, easy to understand the story's appeal to Shipman. It had adventure and romance, an American connection, high moral tone, and a Horatio Alger kind of message. Blue Water was to star an obscure 20-year-old actress. Much like Joey Smallwood, she too had big ambitions and endless self-belief. And much like Joey Smallwood, she had, up until her involvement in this film, had shown very few reasons for this self-confidence. She had consistently flopped in every audition she had ever attempted. Blue Water would be her first starring role. That actress was Norma Shearer, and she would go on to have a long and successful career, even winning a Best Actress Academy Award. Production and filming began in the summer of 1922. Fishing village scenes were shot in Lornville and Chance Harbor, while the city scenes were shot in St. John. Just to confuse things a bit more, even though this is being shot in New Brunswick, this is supposed to be taking place in Newfoundland, in St. John 'S. Everything went together really quickly. It went surprisingly smoothly, and proceeded incredibly efficiently. The film was ahead of schedule and it was under budget. The Daily Telegraph newspaper marveled that
every inch of progress was chalked up without the slightest weight.
They had, however, made what would become a critical error. With few key staffers from the coastal region, they underestimated how tempestuous the weather could become on the Bay of Fundy. Instead of shooting the scenes at sea during the summer, they scheduled them to be shot later in autumn. October of 1922 was, according to reporter Dan Sukup,
one of the coldest and wettest on record. Snow and freezing rain slowed production, and Ernest Shipman seemed to quickly lose interest in technical details, cost overruns, etc.
It soon became apparent that sea filming would have to be delayed until spring. This would incur costs, and costs, of course, were unacceptable to 10% Ernie Shipman, the director. He reluctantly moved filming from New Brunswick to Florida. During this move, much of the crew were laid off, including both Faith Green and Joey Smallwood. By this point, money was running out and costs were increasing. In order to try and raise money, a series of screenings were held in 1923 at the Imperial Theatre in St. John to raise money. These early screenings were received rapturously by locals. Yet, despite the film being completed enough to do showings, Ernie Shipman had an unexpected new problem: arranging distribution. The movie world was changing rapidly. The homegrown Canadian film industry that had thrived for the past decade was the target of a cutthroat Hollywood effort to kill it. Just as Blue Water was set for release, the Hollywood studios forced Shipman's longtime distributor, W.A. Hodgkinson, out of business. Unbowed by the setback, Ernie Shipman attempted to organize 10 Canadian production companies to work together to form a fully Canadian film distribution company with the goal of
boosting these dramas of the Canadian Northland.
Ernie Shipman aggressively decried
all trusts and combines,
which meant large corporate monopolies, something which still dominates the movie industry, the tech industry, the book industry, the grocery industry, the banking industry. Okay, this list could go on for some time, but it still dominates all of these things today. But unlike today, where we just accept these large monopolies, kind of degrading our lives, Ernie Shipman stood up and tried to organize to fight them. He took out ads in major newspapers and magazines across Canada. They included a very cool photograph of him posing with these wild, angry eyes staring at you, the reader, angrily slamming his fist on a table, with text wrapped around him that angrily decried Hollywood for trying to kill off the Canadian film industry.
As a film-producing nation, Canada is but 3 years old. Plans are now perfecting whereby each of the 9 provinces of Canada will have its own film-producing unit. The days of camouflage scenery has passed. Canadians are demanding realism in pictures.
In 1922, 7 Canadian feature films were released. In 1923, as Ernie Shipman was waging his campaign to create a national film industry, only 1 Canadian film was released. In 1924, no Canadian films were released. Blue Water had been successfully blocked by the big Hollywood studios. The movie never received widespread release, and today, the film is considered lost. Despite the best efforts to band together and even collaborate to put together some big budget and high quality films at the very end, the Canadian film industry was defeated and ultimately completely and utterly destroyed. Ernie Shipman's campaign managed to successfully put together enough distribution to get some films into theaters across Canada. His plan, however, hinged on one critical thing: the Canadians would show up and pay money to support homegrown content. Canadians did not, and that was the end of the Canadian film industry. So, come on guys, support independent Canadian media. As for the rest of our story, it doesn't really have a super happy ending. Canadian film industry was dead, and Ernie Shipman himself would soon follow it. Blue Water would be the last film that he ever directed. He spent the few remaining years of his life slipping into a deep alcoholism and soon dying of liver cirrhosis.
This is disappointing. Not one movie I wrote was made by Shipman or the companies we had organized.
Joey Smallwood wrote years later in his autobiography. Apparently, all those years later, he was still under the impression that St. John was still the capital of New Brunswick, because he wrote,
As far as I can see, the only good that was accomplished by all my work in the four capitals was the opportunity it gave me of getting to know more of the places which were my destiny, as little as I thought of them, to become what I was to name them, the Atlantic provinces.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.